College of the Arts at Kennesaw, I think, is one of the most exciting and vibrant artistic communities here in Georgia.
We've built a really sterling reputation in all of our arts disciplines here.
KSU has a unique ecosystem of artistic disciplines all in one college.
The ability for students to not be afraid to express their ideas, to share their questions, to celebrate their research is a valuable opportunity for them.
Our faculty are dynamic artists, teachers, researchers.
The value of undergraduate research is exploring real depth to find deeper and deeper answers.
So it's very exciting to see young people coming in and they want to come to KSU because of certain professors or because of certain programming.
Almost every semester I've been in a show. So there's never not an opportunity for you to do what you love and to shine doing it.
So the opportunities that you get here to further yourself as a musician are pretty crazy.
And being able to do all these different things, I think has made me such a great artist and just an overall better person.
I think now I'm an artist more than anything.
We are committed to a holistic approach in the arts, developing our students both as scholars and as artists.
What are you waiting for? Come in. It's beautiful here.
Hi, this is a masterclass project called Printmaking Without a Press, and I'm Valerie Dibble. I'm going to cover the cyanotype process today. It's one of the many print without a press processes we do at Kennesaw State University, where I am the printmaking instructor. I love cyanotypes because they're very user-friendly. You can do them at home with easily acquired materials. You can do them out in your front yard with the sunshine. You don't need a lot of the equipment with traditional photography or printmaking. You don't need a press. So it's just a lovely process to be able to just play and get outside and have a good time and be creative. Cyanotype is also a wonderful STEAM project. STEAM includes anything that has science, technology, engineering, art, and math. Sometimes you might hear it referred to as STEM, but we always put the A in STEAM. You have to have the art part. So cyanotypes are full of just lots of science, math, technology, and art. I had done a project for the year of Cuba. We had a grant to do an exhibition, and I needed to create a piece to join the students in a large exhibit. I'm going to share the piece of art I created using the cyanotype process, which ended up being a quilt for the Cuba Superheroes exhibit. At Kennesaw State every year, we do a year-long study of a country. It's a very meaningful learning opportunity, and in 2020, Cuba was the country that we focused on. I used the cyanotype process to make my print for that exhibit. Some of the pieces of cyanotypes that I've done in the past include a lot of quilts. I love doing those. I coat the fabric with cyanotype emulsion and expose it to the sun. For this piece, I coated fabric and did a self-portrait that I entitled "The Glass Ceiling Can Be a Door," and I ended up ultimately making it into a quilt. This piece is called "Toast of the Town," and I coated paper in what you can see is a large, like a sweeping gestural arm motion. And then after it was dry, I exposed ordinary kitchen utensils on top of the paper to block the light. After it was rinsed and dried, I drew on the cyanotype print with did pieces of toast, I did clocks, I did handprints, and I did some self-portraits to create the piece. So it can be a nice mixed media opportunity as well. Historically, engineers used the cyanotype process well into the 20th century as a very simple and low-cost process to produce copies of drawings referred to as blueprints. The process used the two chemicals that are common to the cyanotype, the ferric ammonium citrate and the potassium ferrocyanide, and we still use those today. I thought for the blueprint series, cyanotype was the perfect choice of process to use. The images I placed, I took photograph negatives and placed them on transparencies. I drew lines and words and just tried to give it a blueprint feel. So I made a homemade negative to expose the paper on this particular project. I like to coat the paper myself versus buying a pre-coated paper so I can use the chemistry as part of the composition. In this case, I coated a large rectangle and 3 small squares underneath it to have some compartments for the different elements I wanted to use. I really love the organic edge that's created when you coat your own paper. I think it's very important to pick the right process for the right project. I needed to pick a process for this Cuba Superheroes print, and I had chosen my Orisha was Yemaya, who's a powerful goddess, and she's the mother of all life and of the oceans and water. So a natural leap certainly is going to be to the cyanotype process. I love to quilt, and I felt like it'd provide a lot of layers of meaning for my concept, so I ended up choosing all of that for my piece. You can buy pre-coated pieces of paper versus coating your own paper or fabric. The packs of pre-coated paper can be found locally at craft stores. Of course, you can get them online, and they're very convenient and easy to work with. You can also buy kits to make your own paper. Photographer's Formulary is a wonderful vendor that has a lot of what are now called alternative processes that are historic processes. Platinum printing, palladium printing, Van Dyke printing, and of course cyanotype printing. Here's examples of 3 different types of kits. They have the original kit that's dry chemistry. You can get it already mixed as a liquid format, and then you can get what's called the new cyanotype kit that was made just recently. They all produce wonderful results. I would recommend anytime you get a kit like this, read the directions thoroughly, because we did have a case where we got the new cyanotype kit and it ended up having a much longer exposure time that was explained in the directions. So we made a few mistakes before we got that right. So please always read the directions and just understand that this is very doable. It's something that you can investigate, research, and learn on your own. The process, if you can find anywhere, it'll explain at length how to deal with the chemistry, to mix the chemicals, to prepare your surface, whatever surface you choose, paper, card, fabric, how to print the cyanotype using negatives or plant material works beautifully. Botanists love cyanotypes. Then how to process and dry your print. Processing is just in plain water, which is one of the features that makes it so wonderful. There's also a lot of ways to get source materials. For the Cuba Superheroes project, I took photos so I'd have my own source materials to create my cyanotype. But you can use, like I said, plant material, other things that'll block the light. I really wanted to work on how to convey my Orisha. So I felt like putting her underwater would work out well, so I tried different poses. I got a model who had the features, the age, the gender, and the body type that I was looking for, and we did a bunch of poses. I chose some to try to work out the final composition. Then I used the images to create negatives. I scanned things into the computer, I manipulated them, I inverted them, and I printed them out on transparency sheets directly from the computer, so it's just as easy as it can be. The cyanotype process needs something to block the light. The classical form of cyanotype is that the paper is coated with a solution of light-sensitive mixture. The resulting, when you mix the chemistry together, the resulting liquid becomes what's called a light-sensitive emulsion, and you can paint it on, allow it to dry, and then the paper is sensitized, ready to go. You cover it with a negative, original, or some various objects that have different opacities. You could use light bulbs so that it's like shining through the glass, or sometimes people have used baggies with water and oil in them to create, different densities for you to shoot through. You can use certainly plant material and just have tons of fun. And you can use natural sunlight or some kind of UV lamp or bulbs that you set up. So it's just something you want to experiment and work out. And then you also have to figure out your exposure times. They're relatively slow with the cyanotype, and the chemicals require exposure to light in the ultraviolet spectrum, natural daylight. The long exposure times and the high light levels require mean that it really isn't considered suitable for use in cameras, but it instead is primarily used for contact prints from negatives or objects that are placed upon the paper, somewhat of a photogram type process. If you don't know that term, please look it up. It's a wonderful process that basically is a cyanotype, but on photo paper. Strong sunlight is ideal, but you can set up all kinds of sun situations in your basement using natural light bulbs. In this case, I had coated the paper, the fabric actually. I had 8x8 squares that I'd figured out for the quilt, and I printed on the fabric pieces. There's a lot of planning that goes into making a quilt and trying to figure out the design. I used a UV bulb. I have an exposing unit for this particular exposure, so I knew I could get very consistent results, but I could also have picked a sunny day where the sun stayed out the whole time and done it that way as well. And I washed out the fabric. I paired the Cyanotype pieces with other quilt squares that I'd created, trying to work out the whole composition. I had Yemaya, who's the mother goddess of earth and sea, so I chose a wave pattern to complement the Cyanotype images, and I worked that out and created several of those print squares. This is how the finished wave squares looked. I used some fabric that I dyed myself using an ammonia and copper, in this case copper pennies, which are associated with myoricia. I immersed, I for some reason got the recipe to use 417 pennies in a solution of 1/3 cup of ammonia and 2/3 cups of water. And I let that soak, and then I added a little more water and fabric. But I actually let the mixture sit for about 3 weeks to get nice and blue. The pennies are not harmed in any way and can be used for the usual purposes once they're rinsed at the end of the dye process. You also want to try and find as old pennies as you can, because new pennies are no longer made of 100% copper. Canadian pennies are still made of copper, I guess until 1996, and U.S. pennies were made of copper before 1982, so I had to try to look through my penny pile, my change jar, and find older pennies, but new ones will work. They just won't be quite as strong. So I used the penny water to dye some of the fabric for the quilt. I enjoy the layers of meaning in a piece, and these kinds of inquiries expand the learning opportunities and create a piece that is full of symbols and layers. It engages the viewer in other areas. You can draw them in with the science part of this, the math, just really use the STEAM qualities. But myoricia, her followers would throw pennies or coins into the water to gather her favor, so that's why I thought they were so important. You can see here how I actually sewed them into the piece. I included 10 pennies because the number 10 is significant for her, and I had sewed 2 of them upside down to represent other elements. So, I just tried to make it all be something that the viewer could look through and be thinking about and asking questions. With the pennies, this part also makes a great STEAM project. You have the concentrated ammonia solution, ammonium hydroxide, and it's added to the solution of the copper 2 chloride. It creates a powdery light blue precipitate of copper 2 hydroxide, and that forms when you add them all together. Further additions of ammonia causes the copper ion to go back into solution as a deep blue ammonium complex. So the copper, in this case, the pennies, helped create this blue color. You could also use a sheet of metal instead of the pennies, but I just thought it was more symbolic to use the pennies. But it does create beautiful blue water, and you can dye fabrics and things with it. To create the paper or fabric, after you mix the chemistry, you store it in light-safe brown bottles. You can coat the paper all over the surface or brush it with that organic edge that I love so much. I use a light-safe black bag to store the dry coated paper. You can also just use a dark black garbage bag. I'd probably double it up to store your paper as well. You want to store it in a dry, dark place until you want to use it. When I coat the paper, I also coat some strips to test for exposure time, and I drop them in the black bag with that, so I just have little test strips and I have the paper all in one bag. It's useful to have created several long strips of cyanotype paper that you can use just to figure out what your exposure is going to be. I use a dark card to cover the coated paper, and I just slowly reveal more squares of it to see how long it'll take till it develops into a nice blue. The exposure time will depend on how bright the light is, so you'll need to do some testing. The paper will begin to change color during exposure, and the exposure part of the paper will turn a pale bronze color. So you see it when this is the example I have here is already washed, but when it's exposing, it turns kind of this muddy gray, army green color, and this will let you know the paper print is ready to wash. And you can see that I note here in the time in pencil on the test strip, so I can go back and refer to how long I want to expose the pieces of paper I have in my little light safe bag. When I'm printing using natural sunlight, I just lay things out in the yard. If I have flat objects, I'll put a piece of plexi or glass over it so I can actually contact print it, make sure it's tightly contacted. But when you have plant material or anything 3D, it's much harder to do that, so you have to get creative and try and stay out of the wind and that kind of thing. But you can see here how I just lay things out. You can lift up an edge to see how it's printing out. And I use that term because I can peek at it and see if the highlights are starting to develop and if the color is going from that kind of bright green to that army gray green. And you'll definitely see a transition. It won't take you many experiments before you really start understanding that. So you can see this is a negative contact print, printout process. All those terms kind of apply. Where the areas where the light does not hit the sensitized material are going to remain white. The contact print is created by placing your objects on the sensitized paper and blocking the light. So the exposure to strong light or UV light until the high values are kind of a little too dark and the shadows have begun to reverse is where you want to see the print happen. And like I mentioned, the test strips help test for exposure time, but you can also watch it happen, and after a while you really develop a sensitivity to see when it's about time to pull the print, put it back in your black bag and get it to water so you can develop it. So after the exposure, you wash the print out. I just use clear water. Some people add a little vinegar to it. I've never needed to do that. I just let it rinse for a while. And one of the beauties of this process is you don't need fancy equipment. You can just wash it out in your tub or your sink, do it right at the house, just easily transport it in your black bag and you're ready to go. Some fun things you can do, we call it intensification, and this is optional, but you can brighten the highlights and more fully develop the image. Some people will bathe the cyanotype print into a very weak solution of household bleach and water, and when I say weak, I'm talking about 1 part bleach to 32 parts of water, so it's just like a teaspoon in a quart or something. Or you can also bathe it in hydrogen peroxide. When you do the hydrogen peroxide, I wouldn't do the bleach and the peroxide, do one or the other. But I love doing the hydrogen peroxide because it really makes the blue pop, and it's simply speeding up the oxygenation process of the chemistry. Your print will basically do the same thing in 24 hours as it dries, but this is fun and pretty dramatic. When I do it in demonstrations, especially with young children, they get very excited, and we refer to it as magic water because it does change the intensity. After about a minute in the intensifier bath, I remove the print and I gently wash it in plain water again for several minutes. I like to have a final rinse of all my prints for about 10 minutes in running water. I always do it face down. This clears out the last of the chemicals left over from the development process. Be careful when you're picking up the prints. A wet cyanotype can smear the emulsion if you touch it. But once the print is dry and hardens, re-wetting will not result in it smearing at all. I usually let my prints rest on blotting paper to blot them dry, and then either hang them up to dry or put them on some kind of a drying rack until they're fully dry. When they're dry, I press them under books or boards to get them nice and flat. You could also do things like toning your prints, and this adds another wonderful steam opportunity. The cyanotype color, of course, is blue, but you can use different things to change the chemistry. Tea, if you brew some tea, that makes a lovely toner that turns it a beautiful brown. Coffee also works. It's more of a cold toned brown than the tea is more of a warm toned brown. And you can do a bunch of different things. I would definitely look it up. People use wine tannin as a toner. It gives it a really nice dark shadow, kind of a brown tan highlight. Got to be over 21 to do that one. You can tone with trisodium phosphate, which is called TSP. It's an ordinary household cleaner. You use a tablespoon in a quart of water and it'll bleach your prints out to yellow. There's other things you can do to tone them purple, violet. So experiment, always use gloves, read the directions, use the most stringent safety practices when you're working with chemistry. But you can create a bunch of different tones, just research it, play, have fun, and experiment. So back to my cyanotype quilt. My goal for my piece was to depict Yemiya and do it using printmaking, of course, and also women's work of the quilt. Yemiya, as I've mentioned, is one of the most powerful Yoruba orishas or goddesses. Long ago in Africa, she was the symbol of rivers and water and fertility and life. She was the mother of all life forms, so I really identify with her. She was a symbol of transformation. She became the mother of oceans and salt water. So some of the things associated with her, the number 10, the ocean, the fish, the coins, these were all things that I wanted to include in this print or in this quilt, and just put it together to try and create something really visually interesting. We had a lovely exhibit. We had two actually, but this one is from the Kennesaw campus. It's called the Cuban Superheroes exhibit, and it features my cyanotype quilt and other prints, beautiful images, some of the jars that the orishas used, and different things. We have a wonderful exhibit that's virtual that you can actually walk through all the pieces, see them, hear about them, walk through the gallery space in the virtual sense. I've included the exhibition link here. I would encourage you to get on the Kennesaw, arts.kennesaw.edu, and look at all the exhibits. We have current exhibits that you can come and see, and also a lot of beautiful virtual exhibits. And this one on the superheroes is just incredibly well done. So anyway, cyanotype is just one of my favorite art forms. It's really enjoying a resurgence right now. It's got tons of great aspects. It's easy, it's eco-friendly, it's analog in nature if you want it to be. It's one of those things that you can really be a self-directed learner, research a lot about it, buy things online, play, experiment, take notes. I always recommend taking notes because there's really so much you can do with this process. So I would encourage you to start experimenting and see where it takes you. I hope you enjoy it.